Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. There was an interesting criminal case in New York last week involving the criminal prosecution of a man named Pedro Hernandez, who was indicted for the murder of a 6-year-old boy named Eaton Patz some 17 years or so years ago. And the jury came in with an 11-1 vote in favor of conviction. One guy continually held out until such a point where the judge finally had to declare a mistrial. Well, that caused me to start thinking about trial by jury. And so I thought, I'm going to talk about trial by jury this week because we take this thing for granted, this principle, this right, this guarantee that's enumerated in the Sixth Amendment in the Bill of Rights. But it's not something that we should be taking for granted. It is really one of the bastions of a free society, one of the protective devices that the American people have against the tyranny of their own government. Now, notice that in the Hernandez case in New York, the judge didn't have a choice. That under our system of justice, in a criminal prosecution, at least for a felony in every state across the country and in every federal jurisdiction, the verdict of the jury has to be unanimous. Equally important, if the defendant chooses to be tried by jury in a federal felony case or a state felony case, the law requires that this be done. Now, what is that law? Well, the law is the Constitution of the United States, the higher law that we, the people, have imposed on federal and state officials as a condition of permitting the federal government to come into existence. Keep in mind that that's how the federal government came into existence. After many years operating under the Articles of Confederation, which had a very weak federal government, the federal government was called into existence, and Americans were very distrustful of government. They knew the heritage under which they had come, the British heritage of tremendous tyranny throughout British history, that is, tyranny against the British citizens themselves. And so when 1776 comes along, we kind of think sometimes that these were great Americans that revolted against the British government that signed the Declaration of Independence. Not so. They were great British citizens. They were every bit as British as you and I are American today. They were revolting against their own government, against the tyranny of their own government. And it wasn't the first time that the British government had been tyrannical toward its own citizens. And as a result of these periodic spates of tyranny over the centuries, the British citizens carved out methods by which to protect themselves against this tyranny. And it stretches all the way back to the year 1215, to Magna Carta, where the British king acknowledged at the point of a sword that his powers were limited and that he would no longer just go arbitrarily pick people up, put them into the Tower of London, torture them, jail them indefinitely. That from that point on, he said, look, I will follow what's called the law of the land. And that phrase is very important. It later came to be known as due process of law. And that phrase, due process of law, that we're all familiar with, is found in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, as well as the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And what due process of law ultimately came to encompass was the rights and guarantees that are found in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. The right to an indictment, to be told by government before it does anything bad to the citizens what the charges are, to be advised of what those charges are, to have the right to defend against the charges, the right not to be tortured into making a confession or forced to make a confession, the right to counsel in a criminal prosecution. And on top of all this, the right of trial by jury. That is, that the citizens over the centuries in resistance to British tyranny had enough experience with trials before judges or tribunals. They knew that a lot of times these things are just, the judges are just instruments of the state. And even today we see that, that you try a case before a federal judge or a state judge, and they'll look at a criminal defendant with cynical eyes, through a jaundiced perspective. They operate, usually they won't admit this, but they operate under the assumption that any defendant that's brought into their court is presumed to be guilty, and that they'll look at him that way, they'll treat him that way, and the last thought on their mind is somebody's innocent, especially when somebody comes in and says, I'm innocent of the charges. They're looking at it rather cynically. Well, that was the whole idea of trial by jury. The jury is not an instrument of the state. They're not officers of the court. They're not government officials. These are people in the private sector. So you've got a system where the government's coming after somebody in the private sector, and the person in the private sector says, I want my people, the people in the private sector to decide my guilt, not anybody in the government sector. And so when citizens come in this thing, and my experience has always been, when I was practicing law many years ago, is that citizens take these responsibilities very seriously. When the judge tells them that a defendant is presumed to be innocent, they really take that seriously. And when he says that the government's got to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, they take it seriously. That if they have any reasonable doubt, they will vote to acquit. And so why this thing developed, this system of trial by jury, was because of the tyranny of one's own government. And it was carved out along with all these other rights and guarantees. Notice that these rights and guarantees in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment, they're not like natural God-given rights like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. These deal with procedures and guarantees that arise with government, with the existence of government. And our ancestors understood, the framers understood, the founding fathers understood that whoever gets in the federal government, whoever gets into government, that they have this massive power, and inevitably they, at one time or another, will start to abuse that power. They will go after political enemies. They'll go after people they think might be guilty. They go after innocent people. They frame innocent people. And so, and in large part, this was a way governments would use to go after people that they didn't like, that were criticizing them as part of their official duties and so forth. And so the citizenry erected and developed this concept of trial by jury. It's like a barrier, a guardian against the power of the government to come after people in the citizenry. And one of the ways this thing got established is really interesting. Goes all the way back to 1733. Now, in colonial America. Now, remember that colonial America these were British citizens, okay? And so there's a guy named John Peter Zenger, who was a newspaper publisher, that started publishing tracts that were critical of the colonial governor. And so the governor says he's going to have a trial for criminal libel. He's going to try to put this guy into jail for really insulting him. And criminal libel is not like a libel case today where you could prove, the truth as a defense. The judge says all that needs to be determined here is whether you've made some scurrilous things said scurrilous things about me. And so Zenger's wife keeps, while the judge is planning to do this, his wife keeps the printing presses rolling because her husband's in jail, and saying that this is outrageous, that he has to be tried before the judge who's here making the accusations, or the governor or his minions, and that Zenger has a right of trial by jury under long established resistance to government tyranny in Britain. And sure enough, the governor he succumbs to the pressure and says, okay, we'll have a trial by jury. So the judge instructs the jury in the Zenger case that they have to come in with a verdict of guilty. That as soon as they find that Zenger published this, and that really wasn't in dispute that he had published this, that he tells them, you got to do this. Your duty is to find him guilty. Well, the jury disobeys the instructions, and the defendant Zenger was represented by a man named Andrew Hamilton, who was reputed to be the best lawyer in the colonies during that period of time. And the lawyer Hamilton gets up and says, this is a right of people to criticize government officials. You can't convict a guy like this, regardless of what the law says, and regardless of what this judge says. You ought to acquit this guy because he didn't do anything morally wrong. So what he's saying, the lawyer is essentially saying to the jury is, judge the law here, and if it's a bad law, acquit the defendant. Well, of course, the judge was outraged, and he ordered the jury, you have to come in with a verdict of conviction. And the jury disobeys those instructions and comes back and acquits Zenger. And there's nothing the judge does to them. I mean, he doesn't, put them in jail for doing this. He doesn't whip them. He doesn't punish them because of this long-established tradition that was getting going through centuries of resistance to government tyranny, and then reestablished by the Zenger case, or actually fortified by the Zenger case, that a jury's verdict in a criminal case is absolutely final, regardless of what they've done. If they have found that they don't like the law, if they find that there's reasonable doubt on the facts, that's their prerogative. That's the power of trial by jury. It's a system that is so remarkable. It doesn't exist in hardly any other country. It obviously came from Britain, but Britain has really weakened the structure of it in the past several decades. And in most other countries, I think probably every other country, I don't know where else there's trial by jury, but it's the judge or a tribunal that determines the guilt or innocence of a person. And of course, when the prosecutor wants a guilty finding, usually the judges in those cases will go along with it. But here, the jury has the prerogative of even judging the law. If they find the law to be a bad law, like they did in Zenger's case, they can acquit. Now, what's interesting about this is that the jury is not told that they have this power. They clearly have the power, because if they acquit a guy because they don't like the law, there's nothing that can happen to him. Judge can't send him to jail. And keep in mind that the verdict is final, a verdict of acquittal. That is to say that the state cannot appeal that verdict. They can't go to the Court of Appeals and say, hey, reverse what the jury did. It's absolutely final. The judge can't reverse it. He can't overturn it. That once that jury says not guilty, that person, that defendant, walks out of that courtroom a free person. He's immediately released from the clutches of the state. The judge orders his release, and he walks out of that courtroom a free man or a free woman. That's the power of trial by jury and the power of the jury. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what other kinds of laws might come into existence where people would acquit based on a bad law? Well, you can imagine all sorts of things, where it's illegal to be a Muslim, for example, or something, and they're convicting somebody of being a Muslim, or drug laws provide a perfect example of this. You've got a situation where you've had this decades-long war, the drug war. It's ruined countless lives. It hasn't accomplished anything constructive. It's just a never-ending cycle. When I was practicing law in the 70s, the drug war was going full force in my hometown of Laredo, Texas, on the border. Lawyers were making a killing off drug cases, and they were, of course, clogging the courts back then, just as they are now. And the DEA was out there fighting it, but the law enforcement, deputy sheriffs, and so forth. But nothing ever changed. You've got the same mantras that are being spouted today, but you have all the collateral violence, as we all know, the asset forfeiture that's funding the police departments and the DEA and so forth, and you've got people going up to jail for 10, 20, 30 years or life for drug violations. It's an enormous catastrophe. The only real solution is to legalize drugs. But in the meantime, a jury has the prerogative in a drug case to say, we don't believe in these drug laws anymore, and we're going to acquit the defendant. And I'll give you a real life example of where this happened. in my hometown of Laredo, there was a federal judge who had the reputation of giving just maximum sentences back in the 60s and 70s on drug cases. I mean, they were going to really win the war on drugs as far back as the 60s and 70s. And there was a guy who got indicted on a marijuana charge, and he hired a guy who he was one of the best trial lawyers in Laredo. I mean, the guy could just connect with juries like you just can't even imagine. And so Oscar, and he was a friend of mine, this lawyer. Oscar's representing this guy, and the guy was a really poor guy, financially poor, Mexican American, and the federal prosecutor puts on their case, and it's a pretty good airtight case that the guy had distributed marijuana, sold marijuana. And keep in mind, this was the 60s where, you know, man, any quantity of drugs was considered just a huge, felony offense. And this judge would give maximum sentences on any drug case. So Oscar puts his client on the stand, and the guy admits that he does it. He tells the jury why. Now, I don't know why the prosecutor let this go on, but I guess he figured that since the guy was admitting that it didn't make any difference. But he proceeds to explain why he did this. That he had terrible financial problems. He has children, and he needed the money, and he regretted that he did it, but he did it. He got caught, and so this was an open and shut case. You see, well, the jury knew, which was composed of mostly Mexican Americans. Laredo's about 98% Mexican American, at least it was back then. So the probability is about 100% of the jury was Mexican Americans, and Oscar was Mexican American, the lawyer. And so Oscar just goes up there and makes this plea. Now, he didn't ask him to ignore the judge's instructions, but he just made this plea, connected with the jury of this guy, struggling, his family's hurting, he's trying to keep his kids surviving, and of course Laredo was a very poor town anyway. And so, and the judge gives his instructions, which are the official judge instructions. It says that, if you find that he did this, you will find him guilty. And so the jury comes back in. The judge says, have you reached a verdict? And they said, we have, Your Honor. And what's your verdict? And of course, everybody was expecting guilty. Jury comes back in and says, not guilty. Well, the judge absolutely hits the ceiling. I mean, just flies off the handle and starts insulting and berating the jurors. He tells them that they are the dumbest jurors that have ever served in his court, that he's going to strike them from the jury wheel, that they'll never serve in his court again. I mean, the whole thing hit the wire services. I later asked Oscar, I said, Oscar, did you get up? Did you think about getting up and objecting to any of this? And Oscar says, well, I started to get up and then realized that if I just remained seated, I'd gotten what I wanted, which was a not guilty verdict. He'd won the case. He just says, I thought I'd just sit there quiet. And so the jury was discharged, and for all I know, they were never put into the jury wheel again to serve in the court. But what mattered was that this was a final jury verdict, that the judge could insult them, he could berate them, he could discharge them and not let them participate in a jury system again in his federal court, but he couldn't put them in jail. He couldn't reverse their verdict. He couldn't order them to return to the jury room. And the other important thing is that here was a classic case of what's called jury nullification, where the jury said, we don't buy this law, at least insofar as it applies to this guy. Now, they knew Judge Conley, and they knew that he would be giving this guy a maximum sentence, maybe 15 years in the federal penitentiary or something. They didn't want that to happen to the guy. So their only other alternative was to acquit the guy, and that's what they did. Now, that still exists today. I mean, any jury in this land can say, we don't believe in drug laws. We don't believe in this tyranny, this ruination of lives that the drug war is doing. But they've figured out a very clever way around this. The state has, the prosecutors and the judges, that during the jury examination period before a trial, what's called a voir dire, they ask people under oath, do you have any objections to drug laws? And if you lie, you're subject to a perjury conviction. So in this way, they're able to filter out people like libertarians who have a fundamental disagreement with drug laws. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. I mean, the jury's supposed to be a cross section of the community, and if those consist of people, including people that oppose drug laws, that's the way it should be, because that's the whole idea of the jury system. Now, there's a great essay called Trial by Jury by 19th century libertarian named Lysander Spooner. And it's really worth reading. It's fantastic because he argues so logically, and that this is a bastion of freedom. This is a guardian of a protection, an insurance policy against tyranny. So that if a government ever enacts tyrannical laws and then prosecutes people for violating those laws, the jury can come back in and say, we don't agree with that law. We find this defendant not guilty. Now, there's no precedential value here. It doesn't apply to any other case. It applies only to that particular case, that verdict of not guilty. But obviously, word spreads, and all of a sudden, people say, my gosh, there's juries that are refusing to go along with this tyrannical law. Let's say hiding Jews in the attic, or Muslims in the attic, or something that who are criminals, because they're Muslims or Jews or so forth. Well, as soon as they prosecute somebody for that law, a jury could say, don't agree with that law. It would apply only to that case. But that's the whole idea. Is the jury system was meant as a bastion of protection for the citizenry against the overwhelming power of the state, the federal government. Now, interestingly enough, there was an organization called the Fully Informed Jury Association. I should say there is an organization. It was founded by a friend of mine named Larry Dodge, great guy. He died a few years ago. And their mission is to advise jurors of their power. And so they sometimes leaflet out there in front of courthouses, give a little pamphlet out saying, it is your power, within your power, to judge the law and the facts, regardless of what the judge in that courtroom tells you. Well, the prosecutors go ballistic every time there's that kind of pamphleteering, and they sometimes will send out a marshal or a sheriff to shut them down or round them up. And of course, they always get out because what they're doing is simply telling the truth. They want the judges to tell the jurors the truth. The judges are essentially lying to them. The judges that say, you have to follow my instructions. You don't have a choice. You decide the facts. And like in this New York case, the Pedro Hernandez case, the jury came in 11-1 in favor of conviction, but the one guy, it was just based on the facts. He says, I wasn't persuaded by the evidence that the guy's guilty. Okay, that's judging the facts. Every jury does that. But what the FIJA movement was telling jurors is tell them the truth. Tell them they have the power to judge the law as well. And this is what angers judges and prosecutors. They don't want the jury to know the truth. They want them to think that their job is only to judge the facts, when really their job is part of this bastion against tyranny to judge the law as well. And people say, oh, this is anarchy and so forth. That's nonsense. That this is one individual case. Like I said, it has no precedential value. It doesn't apply as precedent for other cases. But again, word gets out. Now, you might say, well, Jacob, that this is sort of esoteric, doesn't really have any reality to what we're doing. On the contrary, that federal officials hate trial by jury, absolutely hate it, because it takes the power out of their hands and puts it in the hands of the citizenry. That when they go after somebody, they want them punished. They are convinced that people are guilty that they go after. They don't like juries interfering with that. They would much rather just go before. Their preference would be just to punish them. Forget a judge, forget a trial. Just trust them to get only the guilty people, the terrorists and so forth, and forget a trial. But their second preference is a tribunal or a judge. And the last thing they want is trial by jury. Now, how can I say that? Well, I can go back through history. This is why our founding fathers, our ancestors, demanded the Bill of Rights. Is because they knew that whoever would get into the federal government would inevitably do the things that the Bill of Rights prescribes. I mean, that's what they're saying, is that enough of this talk of let's get better people in public office and let's get good people in public office, let's get Christians in public office. Enough of that. That whoever is in public office is going to do these types of things that are listed in the Bill of Rights, whether it's George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. I mean, if you can't trust those kind of people with power, you can't trust anybody with power. So here were express protections that our American ancestors wanted. And so when federal officials violate these things, that's not like proof that the system's failed. It's really a proof of the wisdom of our founding fathers and ancestors, that without the enumeration of these express protections, they would be doing this. And now, but the more important proof of this is what happened to Gitmo. You see, because with 9/11, trial by jury was canceled. That's right. The Sixth Amendment right of trial by jury, federal officials canceled. They nullified. No constitutional amendment. No amendment that modified the Sixth Amendment. They just said that from here on out, terrorism in terrorism cases, and terrorism is a federal criminal offense, always has been, still is. That's why you see federal criminal prosecutions in New York and Washington. You know, everybody knows that you can read the U.S. Code and you see, hey, federal terrorism is a federal criminal offense. But what happened after 9/11 was they said, in terrorism cases, we are now going to have an option of canceling trial by jury. And that's what Gitmo's all about, is that they moved criminal defendants to Gitmo and said, no trial at all. That was the first idea, no trial at all. We're going to torture you. We're going to keep you here forever. We may even execute you. No trial for you because you're a terrorist and we know you're guilty of this criminal offense. Well, the Supreme Court got involved and said, no, you ain't going to do that. And but the Supreme Court deferred to the national security state, which they've done ever since the advent of the national security state in the 1940s. The federal courts have just said, we're not going to enforce the Constitution against the national security state, at least not beyond a certain point. And here the red line was, we will have our own judicial system, which consists of a tribunal, no trial by jury at Gitmo. See, they hate trial by jury. That involves citizens. They get a tribunal with military officers. And so the Supreme Court just says, oh, they just back off and say, well, we're not going to interfere with the national security state on that one. And so here was the destruction of trial by jury, the post 9/11. And I can't overstate how monumental this was. I mean, after more than a century, 2 centuries of trial by jury, government officials finally figured out a way to nullify the Sixth Amendment. I mean, it's really a mark of shame for those of us living today, because, it's not surprising that government officials would try to destroy the rights and guarantees. I mean, that was the idea of putting them into place, because people knew that government officials would do this. The mark of shame is, one, that the federal branch, the judicial branch, didn't stand up to this because of this fear of the national security branch of the government. But 2, that the American people, except for libertarians and a certain group among liberals, stood up. We stood up for the right of trial by jury and the closure of this mock, fake judicial system at Guantanamo Bay. But by and large, everybody, just said, oh, I'm too scared of the terrorists. The terrorists are coming to get me. And they traded away this treasured right, this guarantee that stretches all the way back to Magna Carta. Now, why is this significant? Well, because if the government has the option of treating a criminal defendant as a enemy combatant, whether it's the war on terrorism or the war on drugs or the war on crime or whatever, then you really don't ever have a guarantee anymore, because all the government has to do is pick and choose. Say, we don't like that guy, so he doesn't get a trial. He gets a tribunal. And so once the government has that option, then the right of trial by jury is no longer a guaranteed right, because the government can decide at its option who gets it and who doesn't. So what the government really did is it destroyed the right of trial by jury. Now, granted, they still permit some people to go into the federal court system as a criminal defendant. We see that, time and again. There's criminal trials in New York and Washington for terrorism-related offenses. But it's not required. Now, post 9/11, which the courts have upheld, the federal courts have upheld, they have the option. The federal prosecutors can say, well, we're not going to prosecute this particular criminal defendant. We're going to turn him over to the military as an enemy combatant. And it was all a sham. It was all a bogus way to destroy trial by jury. And because they knew that this is the way, this is one of the protections against tyranny, against oppression, against tyrannical regimes. Now they do it all, and they pose it all in terms of we're doing it for you, for your safety. But this is the way always freedom is taken away. It's always, oh, we're going to protect you, and it's only going to be temporary, and this was going to be on as long as just the war on terrorism lasts, which is going to be a few decades, longer than the Cold War and longer than the war on drugs and whatever. Well, it becomes indefinite. And so what we have to do is figure out as citizenry, those of us who care about a free society and a secure society that is secure from the threat of one's own government, because again, that's where these rights got carved out, from resistance to the government of the tyranny of the British government against the British citizens, and also a protection against the potential tyranny or the tyranny of the U.S. government. We have to figure out a way to restore that trial by jury, that treasured right that the American people, our American ancestors, enshrined into the Sixth Amendment, along with the other rights, the rights of due process of law, and the right not to be assassinated without a trial, and other rights that have been taken away from us as a result of this so-called war on terrorism. So that's my show for this week. Give some careful thought to trial by jury and other fundamental rights and guarantees that our ancestors fought and enshrined into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for our protection against our very own government. That's the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week.